Welcome to part 2 of Samvad series on implementing Section 15 of the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act 2015. This series will cover the methodology for the preliminary assessment. A quick look once again at the key evaluative criteria in India's mechanism for juvenile transfer. As you know, the law says, does the child have the physical and mental capacity to commit such offense? Did the child have the ability to understand the consequences of the offense? What were the circumstances in which he or she allegedly committed the offense? These are the criteria according to which juvenile transfer decisions are made as per Section 15. You're also probably aware by now of the Barun Chandra Thakur versus Master Bholu case and the Supreme Court's direction on the need to use the NIMHANS assessment methodology or the NIMHANS preliminary assessment methodology as Section 15 is implemented. So here's an orientation to NIMHANS' preliminary assessment methodology. There are some essential considerations based on which we at NIMHANS and Samvad developed this preliminary assessment methodology. The first pertains to the care and protection mandate of the Juvenile Justice Act. That is the key principles of the Juvenile Justice Act in terms of the principles of innocence, participation, safety and best interest of the child, positive measures, natural justice, and so on. The other is the emphasis that the law has on treatment, rehabilitation, and reintegration of all children who fall under the purview of the Juvenile Justice Act, whether they are children in need of care and protection or children in conflict with the law. Other legal and rights-based constructs were applied, such as the UN Conventions on Rights of the Child, tenets of procedural justice, which basically means that the procedures that we adopt in dispensing justice are as important as the outcomes of the justice process. Therefore, how we treat children, the ways in which the justice processes play out, and therefore the methodologies we use to interpret and implement the law all form parts of procedural justice. Another principle that we used, a very critical one, is that of adolescent neurodevelopment, that adolescents essentially do not have the same mental capacities as adults. In fact, they have lower mental capacities because of brain functioning, the ways in which their brains are wired or structured, and consequently the ways in which they're able to respond to their needs for instant gratification, risk-taking, and other such concerns that generally tend to lead them to come into conflict with the law. Very importantly, the literature on adverse childhood experiences. There's a vast research on this globally about how difficult childhood experiences render children vulnerable and at risk of coming into conflict with the law, about how issues such as family dysfunction, experiences of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, bullying, discrimination at school, at home, and so on, place children at risk of serious mental health consequences, that is, emotional and behavioral consequences that then bring children into conflict with the law. So what is the methodology for implementing preliminary assessments? We have a two-step methodology that needs to be adopted whilst administering preliminary assessments for children in conflict with the law. Step 1 pertains to administration of psychosocial and mental health assessments for children in conflict with the law. And here's what that entails. I'm going to take you briefly through psychosocial and mental health assessment pro forma that we have developed for children in conflict with the law. So item 1, of course, basic information, that is the name, age, sex, location, place of origin of the child, the reasons for why the child was apprehended, why the child came into conflict with the law and is perhaps now in the observation home. So this bit of information comes from the institution staff or as part of the police complaint. Second item pertains to social history of the child, which in itself has several elements. The first one being family issues. So the child's living arrangements, what are the parental relationships? Is there parental marital conflict? Is there family dysfunction? What is the child's emotional relationship and attachment to parents? Does the child get along with his or her parents? Are there issues of illness or alcoholism in the parents? Is there single parenting? Any loss experiences within the family that the child has suffered? So all these pertain to the functionality of a family and how supportive a child's family is or has been thus far. Institutional history refers to in case the child has lived in places other than the family, what places or spaces were these, for what periods of time, what were the child's experiences there. They could even be places like hostels or where the child lived away from home when the child was working or engaged in child labor activities. Schooling history. Was the child attending school? What was the last grade that the child attended? If the child isn't attending school, what are the reasons for this? Were there learning difficulties? Were there problems at school? Did the child have difficult relationships with the teacher? Was there bullying at school? So essentially, what happened at school that may have rendered the child vulnerable? Work experiences or child labor experiences. Why the child had to get into child labor activities, where and how was the child trafficked, the nature of work, the hours of work, the amount of remuneration received, and so on, whether there was any sort of abuse where the child was working, how the child was treated, who the child encountered, possibly older peers and others in the space of work. The other part of social history is peer influence. So here we take an account of the time spent with peers, what were the age groups of the child's friends, what were the kinds of activities or games that the child engaged in. Were these activities that pertain more to movie watching or pornography or substance use, or were they more in the nature of sports and other games that the child may have played with his or her peers? Trauma and abuse. Here we are trying to glean what loss and grief experiences the child may have experienced. That is, was there a death in the family, a death of a close family member, relative or loved one, someone whom the child was very attached to, and possibly after this the child developed serious emotional issues. Did the child have physical, sexual or emotional abuse experiences? This is the kind of information that we're trying to obtain, including the child's responses to these difficult and traumatic experiences. Another item on the scale, and an extensive one on the proforma, pertains to mental health issues. Here we have provided simple screening checklists that are drawn from standardized, validated mental health checklists that look at mental health disorders such as anxiety, depression, attention deficit hyperactive disorder or ADHD, and conduct disorder. So whether or not the child has symptoms of these is what we are examining. Similarly, we've included a scale for substance abuse. This is the adolescent alcohol and drug involvement scale, which is very simply scored by adding the child's responses to generate a score as part of the mental health assessment, to see if there are any addiction related issues in the child that may have rendered him or her vulnerable to coming into conflict with the law. Coming to the last few items on the psychosocial mental health proforma, potential for transformation. This is a very, very important section of this proforma. Let's go through it in a little detail. The first subsection of this item refers to the child's account of the offense. What we are asking the child here is about the incident or the offense through which the child actually came into conflict with the law. So we ask for the child's description, what happened that evening or what happened that night when the police caught you. We are looking to understand the child's perspective and the child's narrative, which could be many times very different from the accounts of the police or the institution staff or families or communities. But what is critical here is the child's understanding and perspective of what happened. This is also in keeping with the child's rights to participate and to have a voice in legal procedures such as Section 15 is. The next part of this is the child's insight. What we're trying to understand here is the child's understanding of the problem. So, for example, if the child was caught in a case of stealing, right? And we ask the child, what according to you is the problem? Why do you think you really got caught? So we are looking at whether not just that the child says, I got caught because I was stealing and stealing is wrong, so I was caught. That is not a very insightful response. An insightful response would actually be, I took something that didn't really belong to me. That would create problems possibly because it's against the law, or because the people I took things from would feel badly about it. So a deeper understanding of the problem is what we term as insight. Does the child understand not just that what he or she did was wrong, but why it was wrong? That's what we are looking to understand here. If we look at motivation for change, here we are asking the child, one of the reasons that you may want to stay out of trouble of this nature may be because you don't want to come back into the observation home or into this institution. But what are some other reasons to not engage in these actions or behaviors that brought you to this institution or to this place in the first instance? Here again, if a child were to say, well, nothing really, it's just that, I don't want to get caught because, I don't want to be in this observation home and I don't want trouble, that is not motivation enough. Motivation refers to whether the child has a deeper level thinking. Does the child really have reasons to want to change his or her behavior? That perhaps in the future, if I continue in this manner, it could create serious problems for me. If I have a job later and I am found to be smoking or consuming alcohol or stealing things, I could get thrown out of a job. So those are considered as genuine motivations for change. In other words, what are the benefits that the child sees in changing behavior? And the third part similarly pertains to skills to avoid reoffending. We ask the child, what are your plans? Have you thought through this? Moving forward, what are you going to do or not do to ensure that you don't get into trouble again? Similar to motivation for change, we are looking at some concrete sort of skills that the child may have. Please note that in 99.9 instances, children do not have the skills to avoid reoffending, and they're usually unable to answer this question. But it is important to document that because it also tells us that the child genuinely has no skills, and this is where mental health and therapeutic interventions play an important role. This whole section on potential for transformation, I want to emphasize, is not to be used to transfer children. We are not looking at a legal use. We are eliciting this kind of information That is, in terms of what the child's understanding of the problem is, to what extent the child has reflected on behavior change, and so on. Not to judge the child or to vilify the child, but to really understand what level the child is at and what direction therapy and mental health interventions need to take. So again, please do not read this as if a child has poor insight or low motivation and the potential for transformation is currently low, it means that the child will never transform, and that, therefore we should transfer the child. That is not the way to read this. In fact, if the motivation is low, if insight is low, what it's telling us is that a lot of work needs to be done from a mental health perspective. Depth therapeutic work needs to be done in order for the child to be able to transform behaviors. The next item is life skill deficits. Having spoken to the child this far and having particularly looked at the child's account of the offense, we are then able to gauge what life skills deficits the child has or had, which is why he or she came into conflict with the law. So these could be life skill deficits in relation to emotional regulation and control, the difficulty with controlling anger or anxiety that may have led the child to come into conflict with the law, to act in ways that were not socially appropriate, or whether there were problems relating to assertiveness. A child who may be unable to cope with peer pressure, unable to assert himself or herself, a child who may be unable to solve a problem. I want this mobile phone, and the only way I could think of getting it was to pickpocket somebody or to steal it. So there are difficulties then with problem solving, with decision making. This could be in also sexual relationship context, where the child may have made a decision to run away or to engage sexually inappropriately with a very young child. These are all problems related to decision making in one or the other context, and that require therapeutic interventions and mental health assistance. Other observations. Here we are looking at anything else that we have observed with regard to the child. For example, was the child coherent? Was he or she able to respond to your questions? Were his or her thought processes intact? Was the child cooperative, socially responsive, attentive? Did the child have age-appropriate speech and language skills? This is as opposed to you may document in a given case that a child was restless, unable to sit still, or was extremely silent, or was observed to be trembling, shaking, sweating, which could also amount to withdrawal symptoms in case of substance use. You may also say the child had no time-place orientation. I was asking a certain kind of question, the responses didn't correspond, the child didn't really seem to know where he was or what this place is. These are possible signs of either intellectual disability, right, where a child does not have age-appropriate IQ, or they could be signs of serious or severe mental illness. In either case, the child needs psychosocial and mental health support, and it also tells us that the child's capacities for the offense were seriously compromised. The child didn't have the requisite cognitive processes to make socially appropriate judgments. So finally, we use all this information to provide a summary. The summary has 3 subparts. Very simply, what were the vulnerabilities of this child? Was there abuse, neglect, family dysfunctions, school issues, and so on? All those psychosocial factors that we had at the beginning of the pro forma. Second, pathology. We are looking at mental health disorders here. Upon screening the child, are there indications that this child might have attention deficit hyperactive disorders or conduct issues, anxiety, depression, trauma-related anxieties such as post-traumatic stress disorder, life skills deficits. All these are mental health related problems and constitute pathology. This proforma would screen a child for it and give you indicators. Ideally, you would refer the child to a secondary or tertiary mental health facility to have your initial assessments corroborated by a detailed clinical assessment by specialists. The third part here pertains to consequences. So how did this kind of vulnerability and pathology finally lead to placing the child at risk and lead to the so-called offense behaviors? And finally, the assessment proforma ends with a care plan where we make recommendations for further evaluation, as I already mentioned, for mental health evaluation, possibly for IQ testing, if you suspect intellectual disability, as well as for placement, rehabilitation, training, or education, as the case may be. What's the plan for this child, in short? So this assessment, this very comprehensive psychosocial and mental health assessment, is the precursor to the preliminary assessment. You need to have completed this. You need to have all this information in place before moving on to the preliminary assessment. Let's take a look at that now. These are just some resources that you may want to refer to. They are the psychosocial and mental health assessment proforma and the guidance notes. You'll find these on our website. Moving on to the preliminary assessment, that is step 2. Again, we are looking to establish physical and mental capacity of the child, that is for commission of the offense, the child's ability to understand the consequences of the offense, and the circumstances in which the child committed the offense. How do we assess these parameters? That's the question the second part of our series looks at. Let's look at physical capacity. What does it really mean? How do we describe and operationalize this concept? Physical capacity essentially refers to locomotor abilities and sensory abilities. So by that we mean walking, running, lifting, throwing. So mobility and hand functions is what we are referring to. Does the child have these abilities? If a child does not have these abilities, or the child has locomotor disabilities, it is far less likely that he or she would have the capacity to commit the crime. If you look at sensory disabilities similarly, these refer to critical abilities like speech, hearing, and vision, which are quite essential to a lot of activities we engage in. So again, if the child does not have abilities in these areas of vision, hearing, and speech, or the child has sensory disabilities, the child may be said to be compromised in terms of physical capacity. So either locomotor disabilities or sensory disabilities or both leads to compromised physical capacity for engaging in an offense. Where would you find this information? You look back at your detailed mental health and psychosocial assessment, the one we just discussed, and you are likely to have documented it under observations of the child towards the end of the proforma. Let's look at mental capacity. Mental capacity has several elements, right? We are looking at various abilities that the child has or does not have that essentially assist him or her to make decisions and judgments in a social context. Because that's what crime and offense is about, isn't it? It is about how we exercise our judgment and discretion in a social context in doing or not doing certain actions, right? So, what are some of the factors that could get in the way of social judgment and decision making? That's what we are looking at. The first is life skill deficits. So, the World Health Organization alludes to a whole list of life skills that children and adolescents are generally meant to have, that schools should be including in their curriculum, that parents and other systems should be inculcating in children as part of their growth and development. Now, these pertain to decision making, problem solving, creative thinking, critical thinking, effective communication, interpersonal relationship skills, self-awareness, empathy, coping with stress, assertiveness, and the list goes on. Now, lack of life skills leads to impaired decision making. So when children do not have these abilities, then their mental capacities are compromised, and that's how they end up engaging in offense behaviors. The second element here is to do with neglect, poor supervision by families, poor family role models. So difficult childhood experiences, children who come from families where there is domestic violence, or where violence and other antisocial behaviors may be legitimized, where there are role models, either parents or others, who model offense behaviors, or families where there may be emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, right? So these are not families that are nurturing in any way. This is another risk factor and impairs children's mental capacities because they affect children's emotional regulation abilities, their social learning, and therefore children learn to make decisions in ways that can be very skewed and have difficult consequences for them socially. The third element pertains to childhood trauma, experiences of death, loss, grief, as well as various kinds of abuse. Any experience of childhood trauma leads to a high risk in children of difficulties in controlling their emotions, especially difficult emotions such as anger and anxiety. They have mental health problems, they have personal boundary issues. All of these lead to poor decision making, and therefore trauma and traumatic experiences compromise mental capacity. Mental health disorders, so disorders such as anxiety and depression that lead to difficulties with emotional regulation and impaired decision making. Disorders like attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which are intrinsically characterized by poor social skills, poor social judgment, high impulsivity. These are the kind of disorders that lead children to poor decision making. Then, of course, you have children with intellectual disability who basically lack the cognitive and socio-emotional developmental abilities to make appropriate judgments. Conduct disorder is also a psychiatric problem which entails rule breaking, conflict with authorities. While we may see this as a difficult child, this is actually a mental health problem. Children who have had long-standing antisocial behaviors for 6 months or more, many of them even since early childhood. These are mental health issues that require treatment and intervention, without which children then have difficult behaviors, poor decision making and judgment. Substance use, of course, this is an easy one. Children make very poor social decisions, as do we all, in a state of intoxication or if they are addicted to substances. So if the offense was committed under the influence of substance, or because a child engaged in violent behaviors or behaviors of stealing in order to procure substance, these are all indicative of addiction issues. Where do we get all this information from to plug into our preliminary assessment? Look at life skills deficits. There's a section, as we discussed in the mental health and psychosocial care assessment on life skills deficit. So you can pick that part out of there. Neglect, poor supervision, family issues. You remember there's a section on social history and family issues identified. That's where you draw this information from. Similarly, experiences of abuse and trauma from the corresponding section in the detailed assessment. Mental health disorders and developmental disabilities. Again, you have a section on mental health concerns where we talked about how children can be screened for anxiety, depression, conduct, ADHD, and other issues. Similarly, on substance issues, so you can draw that information from the detailed pro forma. Intellectual disability, this is based on your impression through your interaction with the child when you're administering the assessment pro forma, and you notice that the child is 16 years old or looks very big, but the child behaves more like a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old, talks like that, tends to want to play games that are more childish or played by younger children, or doesn't have the kind of knowledge that a 16-year-old would be expected to have, or has speech difficulties and so on. It is very likely that this child has intellectual disability, and you would want to then refer for IQ testing to corroborate your suspicions. Circumstances, that is the second part of the Section 15 criteria. As already discussed, we look at family history and relationships, and we document the child's living arrangements, parental relationships, emotional relationships, look for all the difficulties and vulnerabilities in this area: illness, alcoholism, domestic violence, marital discord, all these details which you had in the detailed mental health assessment is filled out under this part of the circumstances. Circumstances also refer to school and education. So a child who doesn't attend school, has dropped out either due to financial issues or lack of motivation, or because of anxiety that comes from bullying or corporal punishment, and so on. Peer relationships, adverse peers relationships in the context of substance use, rule breaking or inappropriate sexual behavior, and so on, or school attendance, in what ways has peer influence played a role and contributed to the difficult or vulnerable circumstances of the child, is the question we are responding to. Child labor is another factor or circumstance. So all the details of child labor, experiences of trauma and abuse, mental health disorders. Now, family experiences of trauma and abuse, mental health disorders, developmental problems, substance use, you saw these under mental capacity, you're seeing them again under circumstances. That is because we place them under mental capacities because these are the factors that compromise social judgment and decision making. And here, under circumstances, they also constitute factors or circumstances which have, pushed the child to come into conflict with the law. So they're in both places and easily filled out if you refer back to relevant sections in the detailed mental health and psychosocial care assessment pro forma, as already discussed. Coming to the third and last criteria, knowledge of consequences of offenses. Here we are looking at knowledge in two parts: knowledge of social and interpersonal consequences of the offense and legal consequences. So the first part refers to the child's sense of empathy, understanding of how his or her actions would negatively impact interpersonal relationships or relationships with family, with friends, with others, and so on, whether in the present or in the future. Legal consequences, we are looking at, does the child understand that his or her actions were a boundary violation, that they're not in keeping with rules and laws of the country? And where you will find this is that section we discussed on potential for transformation. Remember the subsections on the child's insight, the child's understanding of the problem, the child's motivation for change. That is where you'll find an understanding of what the child was actually thinking at the time of the offense and what the child's understanding was at the time of the offense. To come to other observations and issues which form part of the preliminary assessment pro forma, here we document anything else we wish to observe about the child. We can also draw this from other observations in the psychosocial mental health pro forma, but essentially we're talking about the child's demeanor, any views or ideologies that the child may have expressed regarding the problem behaviors that gives us a deeper understanding. Odd behaviors, you remember I spoke about lack of time, place, orientation, the child behaving in ways that are not age appropriate, or being exceedingly restless, having difficulty sitting in one place. All of these are indicative of mental health disorders and developmental problems, which again compromise a child's mental capacity and also constitute vulnerability to the offense. And finally, we have a section on recommendations in the preliminary assessment as well. These recommendations pertain to placement and living arrangements. So, does this child need to go back home to the family, or is that not a good idea? Because if the child goes back home, he or she comes into contact again with adverse peer influences, and that's likely to bring the child into conflict with the law once more. So then do we consider alternative placement arrangements such as a child care institution, a closed institution? If the child needs longer term rehabilitation and you feel that the child could be a serious risk to public safety, then we may even consider placing the child in the designated places of safety that every state has. Second, we are looking at education and vocational training, counseling for parents or other family intervention as they may require. And finally, of course, depth interventions for the child in terms of life skills education, mental health treatment for any particular disorder the child may have, de-addiction measures, so in case the child has substance use issues. So this issue of treatment and rehabilitation, as is commonly perceived, is not merely about placement and education. There are several elements that we need to consider because recall the mandate of the Juvenile Justice Act. It is care, protection, and rehabilitation for all children coming within the purview of the Act. Finally, to look at an interpretation of preliminary assessments of this nature, let's look at physical and mental capacity. As I said, if the child has sensory or locomotor disabilities, then the physical capacity for the offense is compromised, and we say the child didn't have the physical capacity for the offense. If any one of the risks and vulnerabilities within mental capacity are present, then the child's mental capacity for the offense is compromised, or we say the child did not have the mental capacity. I want to emphasize here that while mental capacity has about 4 to 5 elements, all of them do not have to be met. Even one of them, if it is compromised, it is sufficient in order to be able to say that mental capacity is compromised. So, for example, if there was family dysfunction and neglect, but you didn't see a life skill deficit so clearly, or there were life skill deficits and there were no significant family factors, even that single factor is sufficient to say that the child was vulnerable and didn't have the mental capacity for the offense. Circumstances, if any one or more risks and vulnerability, I think you'll have to. Let's look at circumstances. If any one or more risks and vulnerabilities are present, That is, let's say there was child labor, but there were no significant other family circumstances, or there were serious issues in school, but there was no child labor. So any one of these factors is sufficient to say that the child was vulnerable to the offense, because even one adverse childhood experience is enough to derail a child, to impact a child's development and mental health. Thirdly, knowledge of consequences. If a child does not understand social and interpersonal consequences of the offense, that is, does not have adequate insight on the incident or the offense for which he or she was apprehended, this is considered as not having sufficient knowledge of consequences. So if the child says, I don't know how this would really impact my interpersonal relationships or whether it would have any effect, that means the child has very little impact and there was hardly any knowledge of what consequences his or her actions could have. Or if the child has insufficient or no knowledge of the laws such as NDPS, POCSO, Juvenile Justice Act, and specifically the transfer laws, and a child says, I had no idea, I don't know what these laws are about, never heard of them, or I vaguely heard of them, but I really don't know what they entail, that means the child doesn't have sufficient understanding of legal consequences, and that is also what rendered him or her vulnerable to the offense. To briefly summarize, let's avoid any confusion between these two proformas. There is the mental health and psychosocial assessment, and I took you through this detailed assessment, which constitutes step 1 of the preliminary assessment process. And then there is the preliminary assessment proforma. Let's just be clear on what the differences are so we don't confuse these two proformas. Mental health and psychosocial assessments are administered to all children in conflict with the law, that is, whether they are 11 years old or 14 or 16, and this assessment is used to plan treatment and rehabilitation interventions for all children, as we duly should. Preliminary assessment is applicable only to children in conflict with the law between ages 16 and 18 years for heinous crimes as defined by the law. Mental health and psychosocial assessments are conducted first, as we said, that is before preliminary assessment and directly with the child. So that proforma is administered to the child. We talk to the child to get all that information. Preliminary assessments are simply developed or filled out based on the detailed psychosocial and mental health assessment. It does not require any further inquiry with the child. You have all the information that you already need quite comprehensively, so now you use it to fill the preliminary assessment proforma. The mental health proforma contains an account or the child's version of the alleged offense committed. The preliminary assessment does not include any details of the offense incident. It only alludes to the 3 evaluative criteria, and therefore focuses on broader psychosocial context, circumstances, and vulnerabilities of the child. The mental health and psychosocial assessment is primarily for use to design care plans, interventions to assist the child, right? And therefore, if a child were to share something and say, don't tell anybody, you would be duly bound to maintain the child's confidentiality. But in the preliminary assessment, as well, any details that the child has disclosed in confidence in the mental health psychosocial assessment are not shared in the preliminary assessment report. At best, you can draw from what the child has told you to say there are recommendations that you may wish to make for rehabilitation, but not to ever directly report what a child may have shared in confidence or about the offense. Lastly, in case of mental health and psychosocial assessment, even in cases where preliminary assessments are not done, the information from this proforma is summarized into a letter, if it's done by mental health professionals, and shared with the Juvenile Justice Board for use in rehabilitation and care plans. So any child that comes to NIMHANS or any secondary or tertiary care mental health facility, we use this assessment pro forma and make recommendations for rehabilitation to the Juvenile Justice Board. Preliminary assessments are submitted to the Juvenile Justice Board as and when requested for decisions regarding transfer, as well as for use in rehabilitation and care plans. So we have a dual objective where preliminary assessments are concerned. Again, you will find more detailed resources on our website. A copy of the pro forma is available. Guidance notes are available on how to fill out the pro forma, as we have discussed now. So, as we conclude this part of the series, remember, preliminary assessments are only for use in case of legally defined heinous offences and with 16 to 18-year-old adolescents only. Second, every child was, is, and continues to be a child in need of care and protection, irrespective of whether he or she is categorized as a child in need of care and protection or child in conflict with the law. These are largely artificial compartments created for the convenience possibly of the implementation of the juvenile justice law. As you know, the law essentially mandates care, protection, and rehabilitation for any child who comes within the purview of this juvenile justice law. Third, as I said, sorry, snap this. And lastly, and consequently, there are imperatives to use preliminary assessments to direct the juvenile justice system to recognizing vulnerability and risk and taking requisite protection, treatment, and rehabilitation actions towards children in conflict with the law. So, through this preliminary assessment methodology, through these approaches to interpreting and implementing Section 15 of the Juvenile Justice Act, we urge you, friends, to be child-centric, to remember the mandate of the Juvenile Justice Act, and to always act in favor of protection and rehabilitation, that is, in favor of rehabilitative and restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. Thank you very much for your attention. Should you have any questions, please feel free to email Samvad at info@nimhanschildprotect.in. We are happy to take specific questions, to look over any preliminary assessment pro formas that you may wish to send us for review, and provide any advice or assistance that we possibly can. Do continue on in this series and watch part 3, which is on frequently asked questions. Thank you once again.